Comanche warriors took her child. A cowboy rode into their camp at dawn. Summer morning in the high plains of the New Mexico Territory. 1877. The air still cool, with a pale haze lifting from the dry grass, a faint breeze carrying the scent of mesquite and dust from far off. Luke Harrow had been leaning against the split-rail fence at the edge of Mary Dalton's homestead, his rifle slung over one shoulder, listening to the distant call of meadowlarks. Mary stood in the yard in her faded blue work dress, her sleeves rolled, her hair pinned but loose from the heat, calling softly to Josie, who was laughing at the edge of the vegetable patch, chasing a white hen. It was the sort of quiet that made you forget how quickly the frontier could turn on you. That was when the first drumbeat of hooves began to roll across the morning. Not from the road, but from the ridge beyond the cottonwoods. Luke's eyes narrowed, his head tilting toward the sound, his gut already telling him this was no neighbor come early to trade eggs. Before he could even speak, they broke from the tree line, 5 Comanche riders, faces streaked with ochre, their ponies kicking up a wall of dust, the sunlight flashing off the iron tips of their lances. The yard erupted in chaos, chickens scattering, the horse in the corral rearing and slamming against the fence, Mary spinning toward her daughter with a scream that tore at the air. Luke was already moving, hand going to his rifle, but the distance between the riders and the yard was nothing in the speed of their charge. One rider swung low from his saddle with the ease of a man roping cattle, his arm hooking around Josie's waist, lifting her screaming from the ground. Mary lunged, catching the edge of her daughter's skirt, the fabric ripping in her hands as the pony surged past. Luke fired once, the shot cracking through the dust, the lead striking a fence post as the rider veered away. Another Comanche wheeled in front of him, a blur of painted hide shield and snarling pony, forcing Luke back toward the barn. The air filled with the sharp smell of horse sweat and the bitter tang of powder from his single-fired round. The dust so thick it made every shadow seem alive. Mary was still running after them, her bare feet pounding the dirt, voice breaking with each cry of her daughter's name. One rider turned in his saddle and loosed an arrow that split the air over her shoulder, burying itself in the barn door, the shaft quivering. Luke shouldered his rifle again, but the riders had already pulled Josie onto the lead pony, circling away toward the dry arroyo beyond the ridge. The sound of her screams was carried back on the wind, shrinking until it was nothing but the echo of hooves and the pounding in Luke's ears. Mary collapsed to her knees in the dust, her hands clutching the torn scrap of her daughter's dress, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Luke stood frozen for a breath, jaw tight, his gaze locked on the plume of dust still rising in the distance, knowing that every second lost now would make the trail colder. The quiet of the plains had been shattered, and the day would not see peace again until the girl was brought back, or until the land itself swallowed the ones who had taken her. The sun had only just cleared the jagged rim of the eastern hills. When the distant dust plume on the valley floor began to pull into focus, the rhythmic thud of hooves carrying over the crisp morning air like a drumbeat of dread, Luke's hand tightening unconsciously around the reins as his eyes fixed on the central rider, tall, broad-shouldered, his chest bare beneath the fringed leather vest, face marked with streaks of deep crimson paint that caught the rising light like fresh blood, and clutched in his arm was the small, struggling figure of little Mary, her pale dress flaring with each jolt of the gallop, her cries thin and high, vanishing in the wind. Clara stood rooted beside Luke's horse, her hands pressed to her mouth, the tendons in her neck taut as bowstrings, torn between the desperate urge to run after them and the paralyzing knowledge of what waited in the heart of the Comanche camp miles away. Luke's breath was steady but deep, the way a man learns to breathe when every heartbeat counts, his mind racing through the brutal arithmetic of distance and speed, the narrowing gap between pursuit and futility. Around them, The land opened in rolling swells of ochre grass and scattered sage, the morning light washing every ridge in gold, while in the shadows of the cottonwoods a lone crow called, as if marking the path of prey and predator alike. Clara turned to him then, her voice breaking though she tried to keep it steady. "You'll go after her, won't you?" The question was not a plea, but a challenge, and in it Luke felt the weight of every mile, every bullet, every choice that would follow. He gave a single sharp nod, the leather of his saddle creaking as he swung up, the horse shifting under him with the restless energy of the chase. By the time they reached the crest above the valley, the riders below were already threading into the narrow cut between two red rock bluffs, shadows swallowing them one by one until only the dust remained, curling in the sun like smoke from a dying fire. Luke leaned forward, spurring his horse into a controlled descent, eyes locked on that vanishing point as if sheer will could hold it open. The air here carried a tang of iron and dry clay, the wind sharpening the edges of every sound, the jangle of his tack, the breath of the horse, the faint echo of Clara's voice still behind him, and somewhere ahead the rhythmic beat of a war drum, low and steady, waiting. By the time Luke reached the shadowed base of the bluff, the sun had already dipped low enough to cast long, blood-colored streaks across the rock, the heat trapped in the stone breathing out against his face. The narrow pass smelled of dust and sage, and each hoofstep of his horse sent echoes ricocheting ahead, like warnings he could not take back. He slowed, pressing a hand against the animal's neck, feeling the nervous twitch beneath the hide. And in that stillness came the sound again, the low, steady thump of a war drum, closer now, accompanied by the distant whinny of horses and the faint, high laughter of children. Somewhere in that sound was the girl, her small voice swallowed by the larger rhythm. But Luke imagined he could hear it, and it pulled him forward like a rope tightening around his chest. The trail pinched a little more than a ledge, forcing him to dismount and lead the horse, boots skidding on loose shale that slid away into the canyon below. Every movement had to be deliberate. One slip, and the rocks would give him away. Twice he froze, listening, sure he had heard voices above, but each time the wind shifted and they were gone, replaced by the rustle of dry grass against stone. The air grew thicker, heavier, carrying with it the smoke of campfires, bitter mesquite and green cedar, and Luke's mind filled with the image of the Comanche camp, the painted faces catching firelight, the girls' hair in their hands. He tightened his grip on the reins, the other hand brushing the worn walnut handle of his Colt, not from recklessness, but from the knowledge that hesitation here could mean never finding her again. The canyon narrowed into a shadowed throat of red stone and dry cedar, the air thick with the scent of mesquite smoke and damp earth, and Luke Marston kept low in the saddle, his eyes fixed on the faint orange glow ahead where the Comanche campfire bled against the night. Clara Halley rode a length behind, her hands tied on the reins, the pale oval of her face half hidden by the brim of Luke's spare hat, and between them, wrapped in silence and worry, the thought of little Mary burned like a brand. Each step of the horse's hooves over loose gravel sounded too loud, the echoes climbing the canyon walls and sliding into the dark above. Luke's knuckles whitened on the reins as he steered them toward a bend in the rock, knowing that once they crossed it, they'd be close enough to smell the grease smoke from the pots and the unwashed leather of the Comanche gear. Somewhere in that ring of firelight, he imagined the girl sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, hair tangled, eyes wide, trying not to cry. A shadow passed along the cliff edge above, silent and quick, and Luke froze, letting the reins slacken just enough for the horse to stop breathing hard. He could feel Clara's gaze boring into his back, the unspoken question trembling in the air, but he raised a hand for stillness. The wind shifted and brought with it the sound of low voices, words in a language he did not know but understood in meaning, a patrol passing overhead, watching for intruders. If they were spotted now, there would be no escape before arrows found them. Luke slid from the saddle without a sound, motioning for Clara to stay put, and crouched low against the canyon wall, his fingers brushing the cold stone as he eased forward. Every step was a negotiation between silence and speed, and every muscle in his body screamed at him to keep moving before the girl's trail went cold. A flicker of movement near the bend, the flash of painted feathers and the glint of a steel knife. And Luke felt the weight of the Colt at his side, the choice of drawing it or trusting the darkness to keep him hidden heavy in his chest. The murmur of the Comanche camp grew louder now, punctuated by the sharp bark of laughter, the clatter of metal against stone, and the restless shuffle of horses. The canyon widened into a hollow where firelight licked at the base of towering pines, and beyond the ring of flames he caught sight of silhouettes, men with braided hair and long rifles across their backs, women moving between hides stretched on frames, and in the farthest glow, a small figure seated on a folded blanket. His breath caught, pulse hammering as if it could betray them. The girl shifted, and for a heartbeat, Luke thought she turned toward him. But then a tall warrior stepped into the light, speaking to her in a low voice that made her bow her head. Somewhere behind him, Clara's horse stamped nervously, the sound sharp enough to draw one of the warriors' heads around. Luke pressed flat against the rock, every nerve on fire, knowing that if they were discovered now, the rescue would end before it began, and the night itself seemed to hold its breath. Evening shadows deepened into a blue-black weave along the canyon walls, the air cooling with a suddenness that made the skin prickle, and Luke Marston pressed his palm into the rough granite, feeling its retained warmth against his calloused skin while his eyes tracked the slow movements within the camp. Clara Hawley crouched close enough for him to hear the faint tremor in her breath, her gaze fixed on the farthest glow where little Mary sat, shoulders small and still beneath the pale light of the fire. Beyond her, the Comanche men moved like shadows carved from the night, their braids glinting faintly, their bows and rifles shifting with each measured step. Luke's mind counted distances, the stretch from rock to tree, from tree to the tent where the girl sat, and each one felt like a lifetime if they were forced to cross it under watchful eyes. A soft crack sounded behind them, no louder than a breaking twig, but both froze in perfect stillness. From across the camp, one warrior's head lifted sharply, his dark gaze sweeping toward the outer ring of shadows. Luke's pulse slammed hard against his ribs, his fingers curling around the butt of the Colt at his hip, though he knew that steel would be more curse than salvation if 20 arrows answered it in the same breath. Clara's hand found his arm, not to hold him back, but as if to anchor herself to the same fragile moment of invisibility. The wind shifted then, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke and meat from the fire, and something sharper, like the tang of resin from freshly cut pine, and Luke knew they were downwind, their scent masked for now. But the reprieve lasted seconds. From the left flank of the camp, a pair of mounted figures emerged from the dark, young braves returning from some errand, their ponies restless, hooves striking sparks on the stone. One of them turned his head toward the ridge where Luke and Clara crouched, his eyes narrowing. Luke felt every nerve scream that they had been marked, though no shout came. Instead, the rider's hand lifted lazily to brush his hair back, but Luke caught the glint of an arrowhead already notched against the bowstring. The cold realization settled in him. They had one chance to move without drawing that bow's full attention, and if they failed, the rescue would end here with their blood soaking into canyon dust. Late afternoon shadows draped the canyon walls in streaks of ochre. The rider's gaze lingered in the darkness like a knife's edge, the gleam of the arrowhead tilting ever so slightly toward the ridge. Luke Marston did not move, the weight of the colt at his hip suddenly feeling like a stone, dragging him toward the grave. The night around them was brittle with silence, the canyon's black walls drinking in every sound, every heartbeat. Clara Hale's fingers tightened on his sleeve, her breath shallow as if she feared the air itself might betray them. Beyond the firelight, little Mary still sat alone, the thin outline of her shoulders etched in gold from the flames, her head bowed as if she were listening for something no one else could hear. The Comanche warrior holding her guard shifted his stance, the long shadow of his spear stretching across the packed earth toward the flicker of the cooking fire. Somewhere deeper in the camp, a low murmur passed between two men, and Luke's gut told him they spoke of the ridge. He inched his hand toward the ground, feeling for the small wedge of stone he had noticed earlier. A marker, a guide for the path he had scouted before the sun had fallen. If they had to move, they would move low, unseen, like water through cracks. The mounted warrior's pony stamped once, shaking its mane, the sound crisp in the cool air. Luke's eyes locked on that arrow, still nocked, still aimed in their direction, and in that moment the distance between rescue and death felt no wider than the canyon wind. He leaned ever so slightly toward Clara, the motion hidden in shadow, and whispered just enough for her to hear without the night carrying it. Not yet. Moonlight pooled silver across the canyon floor, catching on the ripples of a shallow stream that wound between the campfires. And Luke Marston moved low, every step measured to the beat of his racing pulse. Clara was no more than an arm's length behind, her breath quick and sharp, her eyes locked on the small figure of Mary sitting alone by the fire. The girl's head was bowed, her thin shoulders trembling under the weight of the night, and the sight carved deep into Luke's chest until there was no room for fear, only resolve. He counted the last yards to her, feeling the cold bite of night air and the heat of the Comanche fire curling in through his lungs, when a sudden whistle cut across the darkness, a sound sharp as a hawk's cry. From the left, one warrior stepped into the moonlight, bow raised, his expression unreadable in the shifting light. Luke lunged forward, grabbing Mary's arm with a whisper of her name. But the air cracked like dry pine as a rifle fired from the ridge above. Pain exploded through his shoulder, hot and brutal, spinning him sideways into the dust. Clara's cry broke the stillness, her hands on him before the echo had even died. The camp erupted, shouts, pounding hooves, shadows surging from every firelit corner, and Luke forced himself upright, teeth gritted against the agony, his free hand shoving Mary toward Clara. "Run," he breathed, though the word barely made it past his lips before another arrow hissed into the ground inches from his knee. The canyon, moments ago a place of still, silent menace, now roared with chaos, every sound pulling them further from the slim thread of escape they had grasped. Luke's vision swam, the blood from his shoulder warm against the cold night. But he fixed his gaze on the narrow break between two boulders, the only path left that might carry Clara and Mary to safety. The wind tore at them as they pushed through the narrow break between the boulders, the scrape of stone against Luke's arm mixing with the hot pulse of pain from his shoulder where the arrow had found him minutes before. Clara's breath was ragged, her dress catching on a jagged edge as she pulled Mary close, the child's small hands locked into the fabric of her skirt. And beyond the cleft, the ground dropped suddenly into a shallow ravine, lit by the cold wash of the moon. Somewhere behind, the sound of hooves struck stone and the low, throaty cries of the Comanche hunters carried through the dark, closer now, sharper, and Luke knew they had minutes at best before the narrow advantage of terrain was gone. His vision swam again, a black fog creeping at the edges. But the thought of leaving them slowed was worse than the pain, so he bit down on it, forcing his legs forward until they skidded down the slope, gravel hissing under their boots. Clara stumbled once, almost falling with Mary in her arms, but Luke caught her wrist, steadying her, his grip strong despite the weakness that gnawed at him, and the three of them half ran, half slid into the shadowed bottom of the ravine where scrub brush and bent cottonwoods formed pockets of cover. The air was heavy here, smelling of damp earth and something older, as though the ground had held blood before, and the silence between the pounding of their hearts felt too brittle to last. Above them, the jagged rim of the canyon framed a piece of sky where the stars seemed to watch without blinking, cold and far, and Luke scanned the darkness for a way out, knowing they could not stay in one place long without being found. A flicker of movement caught his eye, not ahead, but to the right, where a narrow animal track cut into the slope, half hidden by thorn bushes, and he nodded toward it, breath shallow. Clara hesitated, her eyes searching his, but there was no time to speak, no time to weigh the danger of an unknown path against the certainty of the one behind. She turned, shifting Mary to her hip, and began to climb, Luke close behind, his good hand ready at his belt where his revolver waited, though he knew bullets would run out faster than their hunters' arrows. A sudden hiss split the air, the unmistakable whisper of a shaft in flight, and he twisted, feeling the wind of it pass his ear before it struck the dirt inches from Clara's boot, sending a spray of earth over Mary's face. The child buried herself deeper against her mother's neck, and Luke's pulse roared in his ears as he fired once toward the shadow above, the muzzle flash painting the rocks in brief. Violent light, and in that flash he saw them, three shapes against the stone, bows drawn, eyes glinting like predators at the edge of the firelight. He fired again, not to hit, but to drive them back. And for a heartbeat, the canyon echoed with the sound, the hunters melting into the dark. Then Clara reached the top of the slope, pulling Mary with her, and Luke followed, his breath tearing at his ribs as the three of them vanished into the brush, the sound of pursuit faltering for the first time all night. But he knew it would not last, and that the next time they met in the open, there would be no shadows deep enough to hide them. Night clung heavy to the canyon as Luke Marston forced his legs to keep moving, one hand gripping Clara's arm, the other steadying the weight of little Mary against her chest, the child's breath hot and rapid where her face pressed into her mother's shawl. The brush tore at their clothes, branches snagging like desperate fingers, and ahead the path narrowed until it became nothing more than a ledge cut into the rock, the sound of rushing water far below whispering of a fall that would swallow them whole. Luke's eyes caught the pale gleam of wood in the gloom, a bridge, or what was left of it, half its planks rotted and missing, the support ropes frayed to the point of threads. He didn't slow. Behind them the darkness moved again, faint shapes keeping pace, and the cold hiss of an arrow sliced past his shoulder, shattering against stone in a sharp splintered cry. The bridge groaned under his weight, swaying violently as he stepped onto it, his boots finding only slivers of footing where gaps yawned into blackness. Clara followed, clutching Mary so tight her knuckles shone white in the faint moonlight, her skirts catching on nails and jagged edges. Halfway across, the air split with the deep twang of a bowstring, and Luke felt a sudden burn along his upper arm, the arrowhead grazing through cloth and skin before spinning off into the water below. Pain flashed hot, but he bit it down, shoving Clara forward with a hoarse go. That was nearly lost to the wind tearing through the canyon. The far end of the bridge rose toward a wall of tangled pine roots and loose scree, steep but climbable, and Luke's boots struck rock just as another arrow drove into the wooden plank where his heel had been. He spun, rifle raised, firing into the dark, the muzzle flare carving the shapes of their hunters in an instant. 3 riders now, their horses restless on the far bank, the glint of painted faces, and the cold glimmer of flint-tipped arrows in hand. Clara slipped on the slope, and Luke caught her, his blood slicking the inside of his sleeve, his chest heaving as the roar of the water below mixed with the war calls that began to rise over the canyon walls. They would come again, faster, angrier, and here on this broken trail there would be no running far. Luke knew that the next ground they chose to stand on might well be where it ended, for him, for Clara, for the child whose heartbeat still thudded against her mother's chest like a desperate drum in the night. Moonlight spilled in silver across the narrow bank as Luke Marston staggered from the broken trail. One arm clamped over the arrow graze darkening his sleeve, his breath sharp in the cold night. Clara Halle followed close, clutching little Mary so tightly the child's hair was tangled against her cheek, their shadows stretching long toward the black water that rushed beside them. Behind, the distant thunder of hooves still echoed, but it was fading now. The war cries muffled by distance, the silhouettes on the ridge shrinking until they were only jagged shapes against the sky. Luke's knees shook with each step, but he kept them moving toward the low shape ahead, a flat bar of rock that bridged the stream to a narrow meadow beyond. The air here was damp and heavy with the scent of pine, and for the first time in hours there was no arrow slicing past, no bowstring snap in the dark, only the hiss of water and the thud of his own heartbeat. They crossed, slow and cautious, the rock slick under their boots, Luke turning his head again and again to the canyon mouth as if expecting shadows to pour through. Clara's skirts dragged in the water as she stepped down to the far side, her arms trembling from holding the child for so long, but she did not loosen her grip. Luke's hand found her elbow and steadied her, and together they moved into the meadow, the moonlight spilling across grass silvered with frost. At the far end, an old cottonwood stood alone, its branches swaying in a wind that seemed to whisper of safety. Luke knew it was not yet over, not until they had shelter, not until the danger was more than a bend in the river behind them. But when Clara looked at him, and for the first time in days, there was something other than fear in her eyes, he let himself breathe. They settled beneath the cottonwood's great roots, Luke sinking against the trunk, his back aching, his shirt damp with sweat despite the cold. Clara curled beside him, little Mary between them, her small fingers gripping his coat. Above, the stars wheeled bright and countless, and the thin moon drifted westward, its light softening the hard edges of the night. Luke felt the warmth of the child against his side, the weight of Clara's shoulder resting into him, and the long run through shadow and danger began to feel like something finished. Somewhere beyond the ridges, their pursuers might still ride, but here in this pocket of quiet, the world belonged only to them, and the cold wind carried not war calls, but the slow promise of dawn. And in that stillness, the thought settled in his chest like an ember that would not die, that no matter how far they had yet to go, they had crossed the worst ground together, and whatever lay ahead, they would meet it not as strangers bound by fear, but as something closer, something hard-earned and unshakable. Out here, survival is not measured by how far you can run, but by who's still beside you when you stop. In the silence after the storm, I saw not the wounds or the cold or the distance yet to come, but the truth of what it means to keep moving for someone else's sake. If you've walked this far with us, you've felt the heart of the frontier, raw, dangerous, and alive. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next story carved from the very heart of the Wild West.